Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our OVW webinar today, Navigating Systems with Your Immigrant Survivor Clients. My name is Kelly Head, and I'm a staff attorney here at Assista, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm so thrilled to be joined today by our esteemed expert panelists who will introduce themselves in a moment. We would like to take a moment to thank OVW for their generous support of our training and technical assistance work. Without their support, today's webinar would not be possible. Just a few additional housekeeping matters before we begin. This webinar is being recorded and the recording will be sent to all attendees in the days after the webinar. The materials will also be sent to all attendees, including the slides and the index of materials. This webinar has been approved for 2 CLE credits in the state of Texas. If you are licensed in Texas and you would like CLE credit, but you did not already put your bar number in your webinar registration, you can email Maria Lazzarino after the webinar to provide this information. If you would like a certificate of attendance to submit to your jurisdiction on your own behalf, please also email Maria after the webinar. And now we'll get started. Next slide, please. So our learning objectives for today's webinar is that after today's webinar, attendees will be better able to, number one, explore the intersecting systems of oppression that affect immigrant survivors. Number two, understand the reasons behind immigrant survivors' fear and distrust of systems. And number three, utilize practical tips for navigating systems with immigrant survivor clients. Next slide, please. And I will now turn it over to our panelists for introductions. Next slide.
It's me. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. Thank you, Kelly, for hosting, and Mary Kate for doing the backup, the technical support on the back end. Super appreciate it. Yeah, so hello, my name is Shirley Liu. I have she, her pronouns with the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence. Just a little quick introduction to us. We are a national resource center. We do not provide direct services, but we provide technical assistance, training, research, and advocacy. And we work with all of those who interface with AAPI survivors of violence, whether that's sexual violence, domestic violence, human trafficking, and so on. And our mission is to disrupt gender-based violence in the United States and its territories. You can see some of what we do here on the screen. And feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions afterwards or if you want to know more about our work.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ayana Wallace View, pronouns she, her, and I am the training manager with Ujima Inc. We are also a national resource center, one of very few, as you'll learn, culturally specific, nationally designated resource centers. Our mission and vision. So our vision is to create a world where Black women and girls are valued, respected, safe, and free from violence. And our mission is to mobilize our entire community to respond to and end violence, and to serve as a resource to not only survivors of violence, but to advocates, service providers, and the community at large as well. Next slide. And so we do have some very specific areas of focus, although we acknowledge ourselves to be an intersectional organization. Our specific areas of focus include sexual violence, domestic violence, community violence, sex and labor trafficking, but really thinking about institutional and structural violence as it impacts Black survivors as well. Next slide.
Hello, everyone. My name is Paula Stordy, and I'm a Senior Director of National Training and Technical Assistance at Esperanza United. Similarly to Shirley and Ayana, Esperanza United is a culturally specific resource center, federally designated, and our mission is to mobilize Latina and Latino communities to end gender-based violence. We are both a local program that provides services and community engagement, as well as a national resource center. Esperanza United was founded in 1982 by 5 Latina activists, community women who, in response to hearing from survivors in the community saying that there were no services for them, if they called an organization, no one spoke their language, or the services really contradicted the cultural norms and beliefs of Latinas. And so they created a domestic violence program that started as a shelter and a hotline, and now we're a resource center. Next slide, please.
Thank you. So our first question for today is, what are some foundational concepts that you would like to explore with participants? Next slide, please.
So anyone who knows me knows I love Patricia Hill Collins. I think she is an amazing theorist, scholar, activist, advocate, ally. And a quote that's always stuck out to me, especially like when I first heard it, it really just grabbed me, is that when we frame conversations about oppression, when we frame conversations about privilege, about access, we really have to think about, well, we talk about, margins versus center, but we really have to think about how do we make sure people at the margins are heard? How do we make sure folks at the margins are actually becoming centered and meaningful and in meaningful and impactful ways? And so when we think about voice, when we think about representation, we also have to think about how folks show up or not and why. So Patricia Hill Collins says, oppressed groups are frequently placed in the situation of being listened to only if we frame our ideas in the language that is familiar to and comfortable for a dominant group. This requirement often changes the meaning of our ideas and works to elevate the ideas of dominant groups. And so whether we're talking about people of color, whether we're talking about immigrant folks, or whether we're talking about folks of different religions, different cultural practices, or all of the above, right? Like in many of our communities, we're talking about all of those things at once. We really have to make sure that we're giving space, that we're giving opportunities, that we're carving out space for survivors to tell their stories and to talk about their lives in the most meaningful and impactful ways. Next slide. And so for me, when I talk about oppression, when I talk about access, representation, it's also really important to make sure we're grounding some of a lot of our conversations around the language that's commonly used. And not only language, but what it means for a survivor's experience with violence or survivor's experience in and within systems. And so the language of misogynoir is something that I like to bring to the table. I will preface this by saying the term itself might be new-ish, but the experience certainly isn't. And so misogynoir is a term coined by queer Black feminist and scholar Moya Bailey back in 2010 to describe the specific ways in which racism and misogyny combine to oppress Black women. So the way I think about it is, how is misogyny and Black womanhood constantly colliding? What are the outcomes? What are the ripple effects? What are the tsunamis that might happen? Like, what are the really big pushes that we see or not? And what does it mean for someone's life trajectory just around violence and around community as well? And so some very clear examples of misogynoir, we've seen everything from Michelle Obama being called ugly, classless, ape-like, uneducated, ghetto, all things we know, unattractive, all things we know to not be true. And still that was the narrative put out. She's one of the most educated first ladies we've had in our history. And even still, she was called all those things. It's survivors being criminalized for survivals, trafficking survivors being punished and put through the system instead of being believed as true survivors. It's Black women being told they're angry constantly, even though they might be just trying to talk through and talk about their trauma. It's the ways in which anti-Blackness, and we'll get into that in a second, the ways in which anti-Blackness shows up and impacts survivors' ability, or even not even survivors, like before we even get there, right? Like Black women's ability to be seen or viewed or feel beautiful in our world. Like all of these things are constantly connected. And we're going to talk through systems. We're going to talk through trauma. We're really going to do some more framing for survivor experiences. But language, I feel, is really important to, and a lot of times the root of how narratives, their larger narratives, are come to be, basically. Next slide. And so when I think about misogynoir, a big piece of that, especially when we see it with immigrant survivors, is that the addition of anti-Blackness. And so anti-Blackness is defined as being a two-part formation that both voids Blackness of value while also systematically marginalizing Black people and their issues. So the first form of anti-Blackness is overt racism. Beneath anti-Black racism is a covert structural and systemic racism rooted in colonization. So we'll talk about that a little bit as well. But categorically predetermines the social economic status of Black people within a country, within an area, within a space. And the structure is held in place by anti-Black policies, institutions, or ideologies. So redlining, anti-Black immigration policies, the fact that Black people, Black women and men, and trans folks still represent large portions of the criminal justice system, and to think about the different experiences navigating those systems, for instance. And then the second form of anti-Blackness is the unethical disregard for anti-Black institutions and policies. This disregard is the product of class, race, gender privilege, nationality privilege that we see as well for US citizens operate with a certain level of privilege in this country compared to immigrant folks, immigrant survivors. And so these privileges certain individuals experience due to anti-Black institutions and policies, they'll show up. And so this form of anti-Blackness is protected again by the first form of overt racism. And I'll give you a quick example on this next slide, or show you a quick example of this next slide. And so one, the fact that when we talk about immigration generally, oftentimes people are leaving out Black immigrants from the conversation just completely. And then on the other hand, we see things like in America in 2022, there was just an article that I read. I mean, if I can find it, I'll send it to Kelly to send out to everyone. But there was just an article that came out about I think it was in Texas, a sheriff had a rope and was like looking for a Black suspect and was like, I can't wait to lasso this guy. I can't wait to haul him in. And that definitely, shoots back a couple hundred years to what we saw during slavery, what we saw during slave catching, what we saw in our institutional practice or institutional organizational practices and policies as well, of like, there are certain punishments that are seen as okay because you do it to Black folk, or because you do it to people of color. There are certain policies that go just overlooked because it's not really picking at the folks that are at the center, the folks that have the most privilege. It's really able to ignore all of the different themes, all of the different barriers, the different forms of violence that are attached to anti-Blackness, just simply. Next slide. And so we're getting into, and we're going to get into way more when we think about and we talk about trauma, but I think, again, the language of trauma as well, like, is definitely becoming expanded, but polyvictimization, for me, offers us a really great opportunity to look at those intersectional experiences of violence, of trauma, of community, of identity, and really be able to break down what folks might need based on their just personhood. And so polyvictimization refers to having experienced multiple forms of victimization or multiple forms of trauma, such as sexual abuse, physical abuse, bullying, exposure to family violence, exposure to war, exposure to crime, exposure to poverty, any of those different layers. And it's very much layered. So this definition emphasizes experiencing different kinds of trauma or different kinds of victimization rather than multiple episodes of the same type of victimization. Next slide. And before I turn it over to some my team here, again, really thinking about how trauma and polyvictimization have shown up in the Black community. I give you all this quick offering. I'm not going to go into it too much, but I also have a video that I'll make sure it gets sent out to the group. But the language around and the experience around post-traumatic slave syndrome is a really interesting concept and experience. So post-traumatic slave syndrome is a term that was coined by Dr. Joy DeGruy to describe the multi-generational trauma experienced by African Americans or Black Americans that leads to undiagnosed and often untreated PTSD in enslaved Africans and their descendants. And so one quick example that comes to mind, and when we think about trauma and how it's passed down from generation to generation and often not talked about or often not understood in its totality, there was a social media conversation going on about some of the just weird stuff Black folk do. And I just saw the thread somewhere. And folks were asking, well, you know, why do Black people run when they laugh? And that's actually very much rooted in the experiences around slavery and colonization, where on the plantation or on the sugarcane plantation or in the Caribbean, wherever you were enslaved, a lot of slave masters did not want their slaves to express joy or kindness or freedom in that way. And so if you laughed, if you expressed joy, you might be literally beaten. And so slaves would run, stick their heads in a barrel and laugh in order to escape those punishments or escape that physical punishment even. Because even if it was the overseer that simply saw it, they had the opportunity to use physical violence against you simply for showing up and expressing joy in even the slightest way. And so to think about what that means for a survivor that comes in, and when they're talking to you, they're very closed. They might seemingly be very closed off or very reserved, but then you see them out and about and you see them with other survivors or you see them with other service providers and they're jovial and they're laughing and they're, you know, joking around. A lot of that, again, and that's just a slight example, is rooted in experiences with systems and experiences with people that have power and privilege. And so something that might just seem strange or off, it might be rooted in generational experiences or generational understandings. Similarly, experiences with law enforcement, the criminal justice system, with courts, with prosecutors, with the housing industry, right? Like redlining is very much a real part of our history. Gentrification even is very much a part of our history. And so to think about how all of that is shaped survivor experiences, and then you add the additional layers and levels of someone who's an immigrant coming into this spirit or coming into this world or coming to, into your organization to work with you. Next slide.
Ayana, I just wanted to add before we go to the next slide. Thank you so much. I'm just we don't have to stay on that one. I just like the compounded trauma, right? The intergenerational trauma, historical trauma, and we'll get to how to respond from a trauma-informed way. But what I wanted to add to what Ayana said, Ayana talked a lot about language, right? The importance of language, and I would absolutely agree, and for us to be thinking about before we even open our mouths or before there's a conversation, and how important self-awareness is, because we on this webinar may say, well, I'm a nice person, right? I care about victims, and that's why I'm doing this work. Yes, absolutely. And to be aware of the perception of our identity is also important. And so to give you an example, we might think, what power do I hold? Right? But just the mere presence, my mere presence may or may not create some fear, right? Or that I hold perceived power. And I do hold power. And if we're thinking about an interaction between an advocate or an individual service helping individual and someone who's distressed and is in danger or crisis, there's an imbalance of power, right? In some countries, if an individual is behind a desk, even when you walk in, might see a receptionist, the receptionist that's behind a desk has power. So just I wanted to slow us down and as we're in this webinar, to be thinking about the power that we hold, that we might be aware or not aware, right? And so even like if some of us have not supervised and then have to supervise, and then we have to be extra careful of how we say things because of the power that we hold. Similarly, it's important to also understand our power and privileges and what the institution represents, right? What does the building represent? Because all of that awareness helps us connect with survivors who are distressed. Thank you.
Thanks, Paula and Ayana. What are some reasons that immigrant survivors may fear or distrust systems? Next slide, please.
Thanks, Kelly. And before I really get into what I'm trying to say with this slide here, in terms of what's foundational for folks to understand or to keep in mind as we dive deeper into this webinar. And I love when I'm doing a webinar with Paula and Ayana, and they go before me because they do such a great job of really talking about the deep-rooted, the systemic oppression, the systemic trauma that a lot of these communities hold and how that impacts, their experiences with violence and just, navigating their daily lives. I'm gonna also be talking a little bit about this and a little bit later, but just for a moment, I want to stop and consider the term AAPI that I'm going to be using a lot on this webinar. Who are we talking about when we say AAPI, or Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders? I usually have a slide that would help visualize this a little bit better, but if you just kind of consider for a second, who is AAPI? Everything from East Asians, South Asians, Southeast Asians, Pacific Islanders, West Asia, Central Asia. Think about how many communities there are, how many identities there are. It feels sometimes like that's over a third of the world. We've surveyed AAPI, culturally specific agencies, who reported what are the ethnicities and origin groups that they serve and what are the languages that they provide services in. And we found that's over 50 ethnicities and over 60 languages and dialects. So, I say AAPI throughout this webinar, but when I do, just kind of keep in mind, I'm not talking about a single. And I think that's probably true for the communities that Paula and Ayana are speaking of too. It's not a single uniform, commonly held identity. I'm talking about an incredibly diverse array of experiences, of identities, languages, cultures, how they came to the US, what their immigrant experience was like, or what their refugee experience was like. And that all leads into kind of the polyvictimization that Ayana was talking about and the layered identities. So, some of these AAPI communities, but not all of them, I want to point out, have enjoyed the privilege of white adjacency for a long time. And there are certain, things that come along with the model minority myth. However, when something like 9/11 happens and folks start going after turbaned men, men who wear turbans on the street as a result of, fear or, bias, whatever. When something like COVID happens and folks start avoiding AAPI businesses or, breaking AAPI business windows, things like that, how quickly, American society kind of turns against AAPIs tells us that despite the model minority myth, despite the privilege of white adjacency that some enjoy, AAPIs are viewed fundamentally as not American, as not truly belonging here. And AAPI hate, violence, all of that has enjoyed a lot more media attention and popular attention recently, but it's been around for as long as AAPIs have been in this country, which is, nearly the start of this country. So just wanted to, start us off talking about that. In terms of, why some immigrant survivors or some survivors might fear or distrust systems, you can see on this slide some of the experiences that some folks may hold. Communities have had negative experiences with systems, with law enforcement, both in their home country, where they're coming from, their countries of origins, and in the US. And those negative experiences will lead to, not wanting to engage with systems in their current experiences with violence. So, for instance, colonization of the Pacific Islands, of India, for instance, and then the historical oppression and forced assimilation that a lot of these folks have experienced as a result. Native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders tell stories about being publicly beaten, publicly shamed, in the streets for daring to speak their own language or for daring to practice their own culture, the silencing that happens when something like that happens, right? The generational silencing. And so they tell stories about how even today, the elders of the community don't want to speak up about things like violence, about things like oppression, because they've been made to, they've been punished for it in the past. There's examples of state violence, and these examples show, unfortunately, that as we all know, rape or sexual assault is not just a byproduct of war. It's not just something that happens to happen during something that's a coincidence. It is a deliberate military strategy that has been carried out by the military, by the state, as a way to further oppress, as a way to further generate fear, as a way to further, break the spirit of the population, what have you, right? So in the Bangladesh War of Independence, 1971, I believe, for instance, women victims still tell stories of what happened to them, and they still carry this trauma. Almost everybody who experienced the Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia, I read a study, almost everybody knows somebody who experienced marriage during the conflict. So these are all things, these are all experiences that immigrants, that refugees, survivors or otherwise carry with them. And these are all reasons that they have been given to fear, to distrust systems, and to distrust the state and the government. Let me, sorry. So, other reasons include there's been a lot of anti-immigration sentiment as a result of COVID, as a result of just, anti-immigration, xenophobia. The public charge rule, which, the final rule has just come out in September, but prior to that, folks feared losing status because of, fear of being a burden on the society and not being able to get status because of that. Were punished for use of Medicaid, Medi-Cal, use of public benefits, and so on. I have a survey that I'm going to share in the next couple of slides that illustrates this fear a little bit more. And then, of course, the COVID-related increase that has come out as a result of some unfortunate rhetoric, around the origins of COVID. There's the survey that I was referencing. It's a survey that we did in partnership with a few other organizations, among them Esperanza United and Asista. So, we surveyed over 600 advocates and attorneys working with immigrant survivors, and overwhelmingly, we found that you know, survivors are more afraid of systems, of potential enforcement, of being deported, of, you know, engaging with law enforcement. They're more afraid of that than of staying in the relationship and continuing to endure the abuse from their partner. So, you know, this survey was conducted in 2019. So there have been some important shifts in immigration policies since then. So it would be interesting to see what the results look like now. Here is a response from an advocate that further illustrates, right? So it says, victims believe that courts will automatically side with the abuser, regardless of evidence, regardless of victim's testimony, solely because the abuser is a US citizen. And it's difficult to assure victims that courts are meant to be fair and to look through all information, especially when the news sound anti-immigrant, right? So I think what this illustrates is, you know, whatever the policies are, whatever the processes are, if victims or survivors have been made to believe that, you know, courts won't side with them, that fear can affect the decisions that they make, right? And not want them to make them not want to engage with systems, regardless of, you know, how right that fear is. And oftentimes, as we found, that is they have a reason to fear because of the anti-immigration sentiment. Next slide. I think. Some aspects of immigration-related abuse that, you know, abusers can use, like knowing the fear that some survivors might have, knowing that some survivors don't understand English, knowing that some immigrant survivors don't know the, you know, the culture and the processes in the U.S. Abusers use that to their benefit, right? So for instance, they hold the paperwork, they take away the passports, they refuse to file, you know, the immigration paperwork, they let the immigration status lapse, they, you know, can be, you know, obviously, as we know, very malicious in the tools of abuse that they use. They will say to survivors, you know, if you reach out for help, you could get deported. If you reach out for help, you're going to be declared a public charge and you're not going to get status, and so on, right? Really playing off of these fears. And again, whether the survivor is here legally, whether the survivor has, you know, legal status or not, it doesn't matter, because the abuser really plays upon that fear. And the abuser often is somebody who's more familiar with the US system, or somebody who is the green card holder or the citizenship holder. And then recently there's been a lot of fear around privacy in virtual court proceedings, right? A lot of courts or a lot of proceedings are being held virtually, and survivors, especially survivors who are immigrants who come from other countries, may fear that, you know, their connection is not safe, they may not trust the virtual space, and so on.
And Shirley, before we move on, do you think that there's a role for attorneys and advocates to play in countering the perception that the court system will not be hospitable to immigrant survivors, or alternatively, is there a role for them to play in advocating with their court systems to implement more fair procedures and treatment of immigrant survivors?
Yeah, definitely. Yes to both. I think that, you know, attorneys and advocates who are trained and have experience working with culturally specific populations, who know that they may have this fear and this distrust, you know, what they've learned to do is to really build in extra time, to really take the time to help survivors understand what the policies and procedures are, what's going to happen to you if you select option A, what will happen to you if you select option B, what will happen if you know, if you don't make a selection, right? The consequences or the potential results of what they do. What does a protection order mean? What does, you know, like just all the legalese, right? Breaking that down for the survivors. I think that goes a long way towards helping kind of break down the fear. If you imagine you're somebody who doesn't speak English very well and you come to the US and you're suddenly hit with all this paperwork and all the legalese and the, you know, just the terms and acronyms that you may not understand, the jumping between the different offices and having to meet with different and, you know, folks like that, how challenging that can be. So anything that an advocate can do to kind of to guide and to support and to explain, I think goes a long way. And at the same time, in the other direction, yes, systems advocacy, we're big proponents of systems advocacy, of finding allies in systems, such as attorneys and judges and so on, you know, healthcare systems, social service systems, and really helping them to understand why a survivor might be resistant, or why a survivor might be doing what they do, and helping them to understand, you know, culturally specific advocacy. That's the other side of this.
I wanted to add, I completely agree with Shirley about the time. And it's so unfortunate that in the way in which we work in our institutions, we're just like pressed for time, right? If anyone, like if you're working in a court or the judge is on the bench, like everybody's like, oh my God, judge is on the bench, we have to move. But if you can have that time with a survivor, also I'm thinking all of the conversations that we've had so far about trauma, and then trying to tell our stories of victimization and having to do it in a different language, that, and on top of that stress and fear, it's going to impact, right, the conversation. So if you can be proactive and have that time, that really helps, one, get a more a better impression of their reality, to build trust with that survivor. And the other thing that I would add is also to be transparent about what our role is and also our limitations. Because when someone finds someone that can finally listen to us and like, oh my gosh, and then you want to tell them everything, right? And then to say, I hear you, this is what I can do, but this is what I can do too. I can't do this, but I can refer you to someone. And when working with immigrants, it's not as working with someone who has been, you know, socialized here and understands and will follow up. And I mean, we give a number or an email, and that is someone not knowing what to expect, but to really together connect the individual with a provider or with the resource that you can't provide. But because you have a good relationship with another provider, you can warmly connect that individual to another provider that can support them. Thank you.
And we have a question in the Q&A. Suzanne Bailey asked, how does citizenship status show up in court proceedings? What are the types of cases and jurisdiction that might be considering status? Criminal cases, family cases? Are there any specific states that you could talk about where citizenship status is coming up in court? Go ahead, Paula.
I see defense attorneys using this all the time, trying to discredit the witness because they're applying for a T visa, a U visa, or VAWA. And so if it's in front of the judge or if it's a jury, you know, bringing that up, their status, which is something, you know, I think some folks have done it better than others, but to be proactive and address that, but really looking at just trying to discredit the victim because of their status as an immigrant.
Yeah, that came up all the time, especially when I was working with shelter folks and survivors in shelter, where the abuser would just straight out be like, they're not going to believe you. They're going to think that, you know, you're claiming abuse because you are just trying to get money out of me, because you just want to stay in the country. They're gonna think that you lied because we don't have photographs to prove that our marriage was in good faith. So I can tell them whatever I want, basically. And that's a major tool that abusive partners use to keep folks out of the system just to begin with, and then also to reiterate that fear as they have to navigate the system.
Thank you. Next slide, please.
Yeah, so we've talked and we've started talking through trauma a lot more, but specifically related to migration. I think that's something that folks often don't really take into account, like how traumatic a border crossing, even if it's a more friendly border, could be potentially. So with migration could come the potential of loss of employment or financial hardship. I had plenty of survivors where in their home country, they were doctors and lawyers, but here they weren't able to do that because of their credentialing. And so they might have been working fast food jobs and really trying to scrape by with that income. Immigrants are often expected to send financial support to their relatives, their family back home, in addition to sorting out finances in their host country and in this new country they're in. And when you don't have that experience, or your family isn't doesn't have the immigrant experience as well, it's very hard to conceptualize why would someone do that when they're struggling here. You don't have a place to stay here, you don't have food, you don't have resources, and you're still sending all of the money you're making to your family back home, right? It's very hard to conceptualize that. I remember having a conversation with my husband, and his family's from Haiti, and we had to have a very frank conversation of poverty here looks very different from poverty in Haiti. And so, yes, we might be struggling, we might be working 2 jobs, but back home, folks are struggling and really deep in the weeds with a lot of stuff, and they're barely hanging on. That's sometimes the framing that folks come with. So why, yes, I'm experiencing violence, but I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to handle it simply because I can't let my family down. I can't let my family I came here to support them. My family, my parents might have come here to support the rest of our family back home. You don't turn your back on people. And so that a lot of times is a major reason why survivors make choices that can be very difficult for us as advocates to understand. Understanding that life events that occurred before, during, and after admission to the new host country can be traumatic. So even if they don't come with refugee status, even if they don't come with asylee status, experiencing war in your home country is a traumatic experience that you're going to bring with you, even if you're not experiencing war here in the US. Experiencing poverty or growing up in poverty is going to travel with you wherever you land now. And so trauma-informed care, which I know we're going to talk about, and Paula's going to help us out a lot more with that, but trauma-informed care as a framing, a basic framing for how we operate with people, is actually very critical. Social isolation from their respective community, family, friends. So especially if you're here just with your husband, for instance, you have no family ties, everybody's back home in your home country. You don't really have friends, you're being isolated by your partner, so you're unable to make new connections. That's a very common experience. I had a survivor I worked with who had lived in the US for 20 years and was only ever allowed outside of the house when she needed to take her baby to the park. She was allowed to do that, or go to the grocery store. So outside of that, she was home with her partner at all times. So being able to know what resources were available, being able to increase her English language and reading skills, being able to understand money and how to balance your finances, all of that, she was isolated from. Discrimination based on race, traditions, clothing, religion. None of our communities are monoliths. We're all going to show up very differently, and we should be able to show up proudly and still because of things like implicit bias, or anti-Blackness, or xenophobia, or API hate, or Latinx hate, right? Like people can't just show up as their true selves, as their whole selves. They're expected to show up in a way that conforms to our image of what Black people are, or what API folks are, what Latinx folks are. But our experiences are so much more vast and diverse that, again, when we're scaled down that way, we really aren't able to articulate who we are as people and what our actual needs are. And so exposure to direct and indirect racism or negative stereotypes also adds to your stress. And then having to constantly experience or navigate the dual racism or dual experience of being Black and foreign, or Asian and foreign, or Latinx and foreign, like that is an additional hurdle that folks really have to be able to navigate. And oftentimes it's very difficult to do so without supports and without folks from within these systems leading you through. Next slide. And I just love this quote. It speaks to sort of our experience as Black women largely, but it was from Feminista Jones 2014. It says, for Black women, a strong sense of cultural affinity and loyalty to community and gender renders many of us silent. So our stories often go untold. One of the biggest related impediments is our hesitation in trusting the police or the justice system. As Black people, we don't always feel comfortable surrendering our own to the treatment of a racially biased police state. And as women, we don't always feel safe calling the police officers who may harm us instead of helping us. And when we do speak out or seek help, we too often experience backlash from members of our community who believe we are airing out dirty laundry and making ourselves look bad in front of white people. And so again, to understand that there are many different layers of judgment, many different layers of experience, many different layers of your cultural affinities and loyalty, right? Like I can be as loyal to myself as I want as a woman and like say I'm gonna stand up for other women, and still what happens when I do stand up for myself or stand up for other women and my community says, we don't want anything to do with you anymore. You know, this is too much for us. It doesn't feel safe anymore. Even when, you know, you need to do that, you have to do it over there because we can't have folks looking at us even worse than they already do. We can't have people picking up on different parts of of things we're working through, right? Like, and I'll get into it, but we can't have people picking apart who we are because they already do it. And so if you're going to talk about violence in any form, do it over there or do it quietly, or like, just don't do it, be quiet about it, right? Like that's the messaging that a lot of women in our community, our various communities are told, or even trans folks, queer folks, right? Like people with difference, with disability. Everybody that's different is told, no, 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 hush, hush. We can't have even more reason for people to hate us. And so to understand that as like underlying messaging is really important when you're doing advocacy work. Next slide.
I have to jump in. Yes, 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 yes to everything that you said. This is so true. This is so true. And with all communities, as Ayana was saying, it was years ago, there was a woman, a Black woman who I was supporting, and she said, if I call the police, they're not going to hold him accountable for what he did to me. They're going to hold him accountable because he's a Black man. And I'm not calling the police, right? Another Latino survivor called the neighbors called the police because she was getting beaten. And this is in Boston. So this is a building with lots of apartments. And the police came and arrested the boyfriend. And then prior to that, we're knocking on doors in the apartment. And there were folks that were arrested and detained and were undocumented and were held and deported. And so the shame and what she felt in terms of her building and the neighborhood of her calling the police. And because she called the police, and the neighbor called, she didn't call, because she called the police, everyone was deported. Like the folks that were detained were deported. And so, yes, because there has been histories of communities of color being arrested and being harmed, a survivor of gender-based violence thinks twice when the person who is abusing them is of their community. And so to understand that conflict, right? You may not change it, but to understand that conflict and to be able to say that is huge for a survivor to say that, and for us to understand their reality, right? It's a reality is really important. But this is an exact example of how systemic oppression impacts survivors and their ability and trust to reach systems. And so what we can do is to recognize it and see what privilege and power do we have to do that advocacy.
Thank you both so much. Going on that, what barriers do immigrant survivors encounter when they are navigating systems? Next slide, please.
So some of you may have seen this infographic before. We call it the lifetime spiral of gender violence, and it was created based on the experiences of Indian women, both based on a focus group, but I think you can imagine that it could apply to other communities as well. And what it really shows, as you can see, is again, polyvictimization, different forms of abuses that somebody may have experienced from infancy throughout the rest of their life. And, these abuses aren't just located in one moment in time, they stop and they end, right? These abuses can continue through many years, they can be multi-layered, and the impacts, the trauma that they create can carry throughout the rest of somebody's life. So, all this to say that how a survivor shows up today is impacted by all of what you see in the lifetime spiral, as well as what we've talked about already, experiences with historical oppression, colonization, migration, trauma, right? All of that. This is the context for which a survivor makes their decisions, sees the world today. And unfortunately, in the experiences of many survivors in many communities, their experiences with law enforcement, with the state, with the government, and with systems have been negative. They've learned that these systems aren't there to support them, are there, in fact, sometimes to harm them. So that impacts what the choices that they make. So click the next slide. So, thinking about our systems today, our immigration system, again, healthcare system, social services system, all these systems that we navigate. What I always like to say is, I'm somebody who I thought about going to law school for a very brief time, but I have not been educated as an attorney. Have no legal, training or background, but I grew up in the US. I was educated here. I went to college here. And still, all of these systems, if you give me, kind of the policies and the procedures, it's going to baffle me, right? As someone who grew up here, who considers English her first language, and who grew up here. If it's confusing for me, imagine how confusing it could be for somebody who is not only, may not speak English very well, or may not read English, may not understand the US and our systems here, and may be in experiencing trauma, right? Experiencing fear, experiencing poverty, experiencing uncertainty about, being able to put food on the table. Imagine how overwhelming these systems can be, right? And our immigration system and it's worsened recently, has really long processing time. So you're sitting there waiting for your status to come in. You don't know who to call to ask. You're just waiting, right? And in the meantime, a lot of times, if you're waiting for your status to come in, what that means is you can't get a job, you can't move forward in other aspects of your life. So it's a state of constant fear and limbo. And a lot of times it's many systems that you have to navigate between, right? Not just the immigration system, but you have to be bouncing back and forth between other systems, other offices, other departments, other people, and explaining your situation, bringing the same paperwork, right? These all have their own rules, their own timelines, their own processes, and sometimes these don't interlock or interact. So it can be very complex to navigate between all of these systems that a survivor must navigate between. We just had an election, so we all know that there can be changes in policies from administration to administration. States have their own laws, states have their own regulations, and so if you move from one state to the other, you may have to learn an entirely new system, right? So all this is extremely challenging for survivors, for immigrants, and for anybody really who has to navigate the system. In the US, we tend to prioritize, working with systems, right? You need social support. Perhaps you're experiencing poverty. Well, there's benefits that you can access. You're experiencing violence, we'll call the police, right? We put an emphasis on engaging with systems, and that may not be comfortable for a lot of survivors. That may not feel safe for a lot of survivors, as we've talked about before. And then in the US, processes can be rigid, so meaning there's not a lot of wiggle room, right? The due dates are the due dates, and if you miss it, then sometimes you have to wait an entire year, sometimes you have to pay a fine. There's not a lot of space there. Definitions can be precise and narrow, right? So many AAPI folks, when they think about family, when they think about all of those they want to bring to the US, or all of those that they need to care for, provide, support, and provide financial, all of those who financially depend on them, right? They can be, extended family, it can be uncles, it could be grandparents, but in the US, the definition of family can be very narrow compared to this. So not all, it may not mesh, it may not jive with what they're used to. And that all can create a lot of uncertainty, a lot of, decision paralysis, and other similar things. So the next slide, just like, in my work, I talk a lot about how cultural communities and cultures can play a role in violence that somebody is experiencing. But just like cultures and just like communities, systems have their own culture too. Our systems in the US do have their own culture. And in order to so-called succeed, a survivor has to learn how to function within the system of cultures. For instance, a lot of systems, and there's been studies, there's been anecdotal information about how the criminal justice system kind of holds mothers to higher standards often than fathers, right? Fathers can do the bare minimum, and they're considered good fathers, whereas mothers are, punished for allowing their child to be exposed to violence, or not seeing their child. They're just held to a standard that fathers aren't held to. Not to mention the bias towards being professional, right? Appearing in court, getting dressed up, responding in a professional way, kind of being put together, right? And that really forces survivors to show up as the perfect victim, to show up as very put together. You have everything together, you're just a victim, right? And we know in practice that's not what always happens. Survivors in a state of trauma, they may not know how to respond. They may not, be able to file the paperwork on time or be able to meet all the deadlines. They may not, they may be struggling with mental health issues or substance dependency, right? Survivors are not perfect, victims are not perfect, but a lot of our systems expect them to be, or there's a bias towards survivors who show up as the so-called perfect victim. I want to talk a little bit about the importance of language access. So here on the screen, you can see some rates of limited English proficiency in a few AAPI communities. As you can see, it does vary a lot depending on the community, and a lot of information is not available in a lot of these languages. So survivors aren't getting the information they need to be able to make the decisions that they need to make in a well-informed manner. And language access can have a huge impact on, how somebody, their journey towards healing, right? So under Title VI, all federally funded entities, including shelters and service providers and courts, have to provide language access. That sounds great, but in practice, we know through our work that this doesn't happen often. And when it happens, it can be, patchwork. Maybe it's technically language access, but it's not really meaningful language access. Maybe it's just Google Translate, right? I've said before how many different AAPI languages and dialects there are. And, if somebody shows up, for instance, they need a Nepalese interpreter, that may not always be available. Or if somebody is deaf, but they don't speak American Sign Language, or they don't understand American Sign Language, they need like Korean Sign Language, that's not always available. In fact, that's usually not available. And so the resources are very small, they're very scarce. And what that means is that often family members or advocates, bilingual advocates, are forced to be the interpreters, which is not, that's not true language access. That's not meaningful language access. Throughout COVID, we've seen that when information is released quickly, they're often not translated into languages. So folks aren't getting the same information that English speakers are. And sometimes courts can gatekeep interpretation. And what I mean by that is they look at a survivor, or they look at a client, a victim, and they say, this person doesn't need interpretation, because the judge thinks that, for whatever reason, this person can speak English. There's an example that we recently worked on about a client in Georgia who was held in contempt by the court because she wanted an interpreter that the judge was not willing to provide. So the judge would ask her questions: what's your name? Where do you live? Just simple questions like that. And she could respond, yes or no, my name is this, I live here. But just because you can answer simple questions in English does not mean that you can convey very traumatic, very complicated issues in English. And even if you could, it doesn't mean that that's the language that you'd be most comfortable sharing these deeply personal experiences with. And so in practice, a lot of times folks who need language services, interpretation, translation, aren't getting them because somebody has decided that they don't fit the criteria to receive it. On my
Can I just jump in really quickly about that? So yeah, it just came up when you were talking about, make sure your services are appropriate and reflective of what folks' needs are. Also make sure that the people doing the interpretation are credentialed, or make sure that they're really interpreting in the right way. I've had the experience with several survivors where we connected them to interpretation resources, and then the interpreter went off script from what they were saying, or wasn't properly translating what they were saying, or was feeding in their own judgment about what the person was saying. And so it again shifted what the survivor was actually trying to get to and really impacted their case. So to make sure when you have court translators, they're folks that are appropriate for the position. And even if it's not in a court setting specifically, whatever translation or interpretive services you're using, that the survivor is okay with those services being used, so okay with the person doing the translating as well, because I had many survivors did not want to talk to male translators or interpreters for many different reasons, and that the person is translating or interpreting appropriately.
Thank you for that. Yeah, that's such a great point. And we've heard similar stories of, communities can be very small and tight-knit, language communities. And so a lot of times survivors, they may know the interpreter because it's only a few people speak this language. So they may know the interpreter. That interpreter may be contributing to, so we've had instances where the person who shows up as the interpreter has conveyed things, putting their own bias against the survivor, or the survivor didn't want to interact with that person because they knew this person and they didn't want everybody in their community to hear about their experience.
I also wanted to add, so this is something that we can do proactively, right? And so proactively, just to look at who are the interpreters that are available, do we know them, build that relationship, have an understanding of who they are, and also if you can, if there is time, either the day in which you'll need the interpretation, for there to be a meeting. It doesn't have to be a lengthy meeting, but just a meeting or connecting with the survivor and the interpreter, right? The interpreter have a code of ethics, right? They're supposed to be very professional and not biased, but just, again, looking at trauma and a stress, just knowing that someone is going to be speaking for me in a courtroom is very anxiety producing. And so to sort of know, okay, this individual is the individual who's going to be speaking for me and speaking about the violence I experienced, is a trauma-informed practice that we can do proactively.
I'll just give one more quick example to Paula's point. I worked with a survivor, and I'm going to change details, but I worked with a survivor, and her community that she was from in her home country were nomadic people. So they traveled a lot. The dialect they used was very different from folks in the city. So the interpreter that we had could not understand her and was making judgments because he could not understand her dialect. So was saying things to me like, oh, well, she's one of those nomads. We don't, we can't, they're uneducated, they're this, they're that. And I was just like, yeah, we're not going to be able to use you. We have to find someone different. And then just the last point, I'm passing it back to you, Shirley. Just the last point, also make sure, so to Shirley's point, I think she mentioned that, again, when you're coming from other parts of the world, you're not going to use American Sign Language. And I think a lot of us forget that just because that's like the standard practice in America is ASL. But folks from around the world are not going to use that. So budget in to have those additional services, because it's much more complicated potentially to make sure you're able to pay 2 different or 3 different, or even 4 different interpreters for one survivor.
Yeah, those are all great points and examples. It can be costly, but we always advocate for line items, right, for language access, making sure that this is budgeted for, and it can, yeah, anyway. So just very quickly here, I think Ayana has a slide about, the potential consequences of not having language access later on. So I don't want to spend too much more time. But, here's an example of what the survivors experience who was not provided interpretation and who did not speak English. She's charged with obstruction of governmental administration. She ended up pleading guilty in criminal court, because she did not speak English and because she was not given an interpreter. Pass it on to Ayana.
Yes, so this is just our reminder for the group, for the folks in the front, middle, and the back. Please make sure you use caution when describing barriers. Being Black is not a barrier for me. White supremacy or colorism or anti-Blackness are the barriers. Being female is not a barrier for me. Patriarchy, misogynoir are the barriers. Name the systems of power. These are the barriers, not the people's identities. Because again, when you frame it that way, you're putting the onus on someone simply born for being born, right? Like for simply living in the world. Like there's nothing I can control about my intersecting identities or would want to change even. And so name the actual barriers, not the identities. And then racialized sexual tropes absolutely exist for all of our communities. I can name off the top of my head a few from each of our groups. But again, to really understand that historically and now, there are certain narratives about our communities, and especially about women within our communities, that are long prevailing and have really substantial impacts on how you view yourself, how you view violence, how you normalize violence, and how folks community and socially do that towards you as well. So I'm going to go through these pretty quickly, but to think about how the myth of the overbearing matriarch, mammy, and Jezebel images all came directly out of the slave eras. The matriarch was seen as overbearing, drove men away, was a workhorse, could reproduce but wasn't desirable. We then have the mammy. She was seen as the happy slave, loved to serve, happy with her station in life. And then the Jezebel, who was the direct opposite of the mammy. She was seen as hypersexual, sexually available and indiscriminate, flirtatious. So whatever physical or sexual violence was enacted upon her body, she deserved it. That's just par for the course. And then we have the welfare queen, sapphire, and Black superwoman images that came later, closer to the civil rights decades and war on drugs. We have the welfare queen, which is seen as lazy, scamming the system, doesn't want to work, but wants to keep having a whole bunch of kids. The sapphire, she is the neo-Jezebel image, so loud, angry, exploits men for money. This is where the gold digger trope comes from. And then the Black superwoman, she will, she'll figure it out. She can make it happen. She's resilient, she's strong. Seemingly the most positive from this list, but even still incredibly limiting, because then Black women aren't seen as vulnerable. Then Black women aren't seen as needing help, aren't seen as fragile in some cases. And so when I think about it collectively between our three groups, you know, we have the geisha image, we have the male elder bride image, we have the baby mama, we have the feisty Latina. Like all of these different narratives are constantly at play, even when we ourselves don't conform to those narratives about us. It's gonna be put on us in some way. So as an advocate, whether you're white, Black, or other, to understand that about our communities and about the folks in those communities is really important. Even some folks would assume that from this list of talking about Black women, that's just the American perspective. Absolutely not, right? Like we had slavery all over the world. And so to think about how the mammy is gonna show up in the Caribbean, or how the overbearing matriarch is gonna show up in Africa, the label might change some, but the overarching narrative is still there and it's still impacting the survivors that we're working with.
Ayana, can I add something?
Yeah.
This is not limited to survivors that we work with, right? This is women of color, Black women specifically in the slide, but we're talking about advocates, attorneys, judges, police officers, any woman in this field. And so that is also going to play out in the work that we do, and our vicarious trauma and our resilience and the microaggressions that we experience, both in and out of the court and in our meetings. And so this is something too to be looked at in an institutional level of how are we taking care of our staff and creating a trauma-informed, inclusive work environment.
Absolutely. And I love that you made sure to bring that back, bring that point up, because the last label here, the angry, bitter Black woman, that label is literally applied to any Black woman that's like, no, I'm not okay with that. Let me push back. Let me have a differing opinion. Let me not be smiley and jovial today. Like I want to sit in my discomfort. Like any Black woman, any woman of color is very easily written off when they're called angry and bitter. And so again, to really think about that in terms of just general day-to-day, as Paula was saying, of what happens when a Black attorney pushes back, or what happened when a Latina attorney is like, no, like we need to make sure we have language access, how easily folks are dismissed, and the impact that has, again, not only as us as community members, but especially in terms of supporting survivors.
And this is a question for any of the panelists. What are your thoughts on how these tropes impact immigrant survivors when they're trying to navigate systems, and how can attorneys and advocates respond?
Say, I mean, I've seen it. I mean, I'm dating myself. I decades ago started working at the district attorney's office as a victim witness advocate. And if there was a request for an interpreter, there were literally eyes rolled. Oh, no, we can't. We have to wait. We have to wait for the interpreter. We can't. Yeah, no, we were going to hear this hearing today, but no, we have to wait for the interpreter. Right. So it's this already anti-immigrant sentiments, right? If there are anti-immigrant sentiments, they're going to come out, whether it's intended or not. And so looking at just the humanity, right? The lack of humanity and relating to survivors who are immigrants. I would say also there are different types. You know, this is a great slide. All right, Ayana listed various types for immigrant survivors, right? And I would say that when you're looking at immigrants, as Ayana stated before, and then Shirley, that there's racism as well attributed to like who immigrants and immigrants, right? My parents were immigrants and came to this country and so forth, as opposed to these immigrants are coming in, right? And so who is a good immigrant, who is not the good immigrant? So it's hard to think like, oh, that's just awful that it happens. And I think that is something that we don't like to accept. But accepting that we may not see those injustices if we don't experience them, but to know that they are experienced by immigrants is important, right? And to hold and uplift that. And if we're told that, it's because there's trust, right? We are trusted. That's why we're let in to this injustice. And once we are trusted, is then important to validate that, to thank them for that, and then also follow up with realistic things that we can do, because we're all doing this work individually as advocates every single day, but that advocacy impacts systems and culture. So we do have power to turn it around.
Thanks, Paula. And I just wanted to show this as well, really as an acknowledgement that women and girls of color are never seen as pure in the same pure, virginal, needing to be protected, any of that, even girlish, like are not really given that same space as white girls and white women, for instance. And so when we talk about rape culture, when we talk about norms, when we talk about adultification or hypersexualization, it exists in all of our communities, again, for different reasons. But again, to really be tuned into the narrative, the language, the ways in which we're talking about sexual violence even, and like who the onus is put on for experiencing sexual violence or experiencing gendered violence. Like that's why we really have to delve into culture. That's why we really have to delve into talking about race, into talking about ethnicity. And so again, when we talk about, you know, the Jezebel, and when she seemingly shows up in court, it's really that much more difficult to get folks to view her as a victim, because they've already determined, maybe not, you know, personally, like societally, like it's already been determined that Black women are hypersexual, you know, flirtatious, that they are sexually aggressive. And so if you're all of those things, how can you also be a victim? So narrative, language, imagery all go together. It's constantly shaping and reshaping how we view and how we respond to survivors. And then unpacking some of these other implicit or internalized biases that Black survivors may experience. Absolutely, respectability politics is something to talk about. Briefly, respectability politics was really a protective strategy at first. It was very much meant to, you know, the thinking was if you show up dressed well, if you speak well, you know, if you carry yourself well, that professionalized image almost, then you can't be hurt, or we're less likely to be hurt, or we're less likely to be taken advantage of. And yes, it was initially thought of as a protective factor, but we've seen, especially for women who experience sexual and domestic violence, it's, you know, you can't show up badly in public. You can't air out your dirty laundry. You can't show up with your hair not done well and then expect people to take you seriously even. Hair politics is very real. In 2022, I could still be fired from many different jobs simply for having locks, and especially if I don't retwist them every 2 weeks, right? Like that's a reality. And so when we say, you know, just go out and get a job, but there are jobs that have policies that read, you know, if you don't have certain grooming standards, you can't work there, then it's not that simple. Classism has been a major theme that we've been talking around throughout this webinar today. Classism absolutely across ethnic communities, across racial communities, impacts people. So I think it was Shirley that was talking, or it might have been Shirley, I don't remember. One of the great folks I'm on here with was talking about, you know, when you come to the US, all these different assumptions that are made about you or the appropriateness of your being there. If you are brown and poor, like, woo, coming in and being accepted is going to be a reach. We know that with classism, with class privilege, that if you have class privilege, you're more likely to be accepted, not fully, but it's a little bit easier of an entryway compared to someone who's seen as going to be scamming the system, relying on the system, having a whole bunch of kids, using up all our resources. Like that's the comparative narrative that's put forward about folks. And we really have to tune into that. Access to resources, we've been talking through and talking about the adultification of young Black and brown girls as well. Again, we're not giving that same space to be viewed as pure or viewed as innocent even. And so when you experience violence, of course you should have known better. Of course you should have done better. Of course you should have stuck with what you're supposed to be doing. Like we have cultural norms for a reason. Like those are the messages that are put on folks when they experience violence. Heteronormativity is also a piece that we didn't really talk through, but absolutely impacts survivors from different communities that we serve. So for instance, there are certain countries we know historically have not been welcoming to queer and LGBTQIA folks, or have had policies or laws outlawing your ability to express love to who you want. And so if that's been your lived experience and you come here and in different ways, you're still seeing those things or being impacted that way or experiencing violence from those threads, it's still gonna impact you and cause trauma. And then something that we don't talk enough about, and I would say, especially for the Black community, we don't talk enough about the fact that there are so many different religions, faith practices, cultural practices that exist. The Black community is not a monolith. Black faith is not a monolith either. And so I've been in spaces with even other Black people that will say things like, well, all Black Americans are Christian, or all Black folks are Christian. And it's like, no, we're not. And even when we are, we're not going to practice in the same way. So being fluid and understanding these different cultural nuances as well is really important, even when you're in a court setting. Like, it's still impacting and shaping someone's existence and someone's reality.
Thank you, Ayana. And to go back, we've talked about language access. The lack of language access is harmful and dangerous. It's a risk to safety. It can ultimately, can lead to someone's death of being killed. I'm not being dramatic. Just years and years ago, I was a program director. We had Spanish-speaking staff, and a survivor came in who spoke Portuguese. She was from Brazil, and the receptionist said, "No one's available. Can you speak to her?" And I speak Spanish and not Portuguese. But in the limited, and I was speaking Spanish and she was speaking Portuguese, I thought I heard that he had strangled her, right? Which is an indicator of lethality. And I gestured with my hands and she nodded. And at that point, I was so angry that I was the best response to her. And so I immediately contacted a culture-specific Portuguese-speaking organization, and then we were able to support the survivor. And then since then, we had money to create a Portuguese-speaking program. But it is essential to have language access for many reasons. Obviously, if we're thinking about it's so difficult because of shame, fear, confusion for survivors to actually come forth and speak their truth about the violence that they've experienced, we have to have language access. If you go to our website, which is esperanzaunited.org, as well as API, we have lots of information on language access. Please visit our website. We have templates. If you don't have a language access plan, you can look through our website, and we have a template that you can use. We also provide training and technical assistance to support you in that. That is also very important with the trauma and vicarious trauma, bilingual, bicultural advocates are experiencing if they are the only one in the organization that is providing, responding to the requirement of having language access. Next slide.
Thank you, Paula. And for all of the panelists, what are some best practices for attorneys and advocates who are navigating systems with their immigrant survivor clients? Next slide, please.
So, I think one of the most important things is that person-to-person connection, the advocate or attorney client connection, showing up and treating somebody as if they're a human with all the experiences that they have carried, with all the experiences that their community holds, and their current experience of violence. That goes so much a longer way than just showing up, with your intake form, asking these curt and cold questions, and making somebody potentially feel re-traumatized, or just treated like a, like a burden, right? Like somebody that needs help. That's an onus on the system or on the society. And so when we held a listening session in 2020, right before the pandemic, when travel was still, safe, and somebody shared that the biggest difference as a legal advocate, the biggest difference they saw in their work was when they stopped showing up with just a stack of forms. When they showed up and they asked, how are you? What have you experienced? And you just let the survivor speak and tell their story at their own pace, in their own words. Potentially, that could take a lot more time, but that's something that's more empowering to the survivor in their healing process. It's not only more empowering, but it also builds more trust with the survivor, with the client, than if you have the forms in front of you and it becomes this almost like a barrier between the two of you. Next slide. And then the other thing is, keeping in mind, advocates and attorneys often are the only voice between the survivor and all the systems that the survivor has to navigate between. And, the survivor on their own may not understand the legalese, again, may not understand the language, may not understand the processes. And the people that are there to help them navigate are the advocates, the legal advocates and the attorneys. And that can create, that's a huge charge, obviously, and that just makes it all the more important to have the relationship be collaborative, have the relationship be one of trust, keeping in mind all the trauma that somebody may have experienced and how you may cause that trauma to be re-triggered, to cause that trauma to be flared up again. Internal biases, everybody has their own biases, no matter how much work you've put into kind of being mindful and being understanding. Everybody, everybody has bias, everybody holds preconceived notions, prejudices, but being mindful of these, these things in an interaction with clients can help avoid, re-traumatizing them and re-triggering them. And then lastly on the slide, sharing information, between systems. So if a survivor is involved in more than one system, like the immigration system and social services, there can be rules and regulations for how their information is shared between the systems, and that can create a lot of fear for the client. Not only for what would happen to their immigration status, for instance, in the system, but also, that creates more potential for their abuser or somebody else in their community to find them, to look them up and to see, what help that they've been using, what systems they've been accessing. So helping the client understand, the confidentiality protections, when their information is going to be protected and when their information is going to be shared, is very useful to the client as well. We always want to be empowering survivors, and I've talked to advocates about how, for instance, a survivor was presented with options and they kept asking the advocate, what should I do? Should I choose this course or should I choose that course? And because they viewed the advocate as somebody who was there to help them and to guide them, and somebody who understands the US legal system and the US immigration system, they wanted to be told what to do. But, I and this advocate had a conversation about how, as advocates, we're always in the position of where we're presenting choices. We're not prescribing. We're not saying you should do option A over option B. No matter what our personal perspective is, no matter what our opinion is, we don't want to be in the position of saying you have to do this, because that goes a long way, again, towards empowering survivors, of showing survivors that they have the, they are the leaders of their own journeys. They have agency over their own choices. And sometimes that means, they pick an option that we would not have wanted them to pick. Sometimes that means that they don't pick an option, and there could be consequences for that, but at the heart of it, they still have to be in command of their own decisions. I've spoken about this before. A lot of time is needed, sometimes to explain and then re-explain, and then re-explain potentially the choices, the processes, the technologies, right? All this takes a lot of time, and all this takes a lot of energy and effort. Prioritizing language access. We've kind of driven this point to the ground, but I think it's one of the most important things that that folks should walk away with today, is that language access can be the deciding factor between, how whether a survivor is able to access healing, access justice, or whether or not that survivor becomes held in contempt, becomes arrested, becomes charged, loses access to their children, and so on. And then lastly, if there are options for alternative solutions outside of systems, those should always be presented as options, because of the lack of trust that survivors have with systems, because of the lack of familiarity, and just, as a different option. If there's, community solutions for justice, community supports, for food, for shelter, those options should also be to be identified and to be shared with the survivors. Next slide.
Yeah, so just a little bit more on the importance of cultural responsiveness. You should always work with the understanding that culture shapes identity. Culture shapes relationships, connection. Really make sure that you're giving voice to those who have been silenced and or victimized, creating a safer, braver space. It may not always 100% feel safe or brave, but that's always the goal of, like, how do you move towards it and how do you reframe when necessary? Cultural responsiveness builds trust and mutual respect, mutual understanding as well. It's a learning opportunity on both sides in many cases. When you have culturally responsive resources and communication styles, you also develop equitable services and resources. You enhance safety planning and community engagement strategies when you're delving into culture, delving into the different nuances. And then, of course, when you're doing culturally responsive work, it's really vital to your work and to your advocacy to recognize continuously your own privilege and how it's going to impact the relationship you have with the survivor that you're working with. And so when we're talking about providing culturally specific, culturally relevant services, of course, language access, I hope we've nailed that point home at this point. Like, you have to be language accessible. And when I say language access, it's not just like the actual language, it's also the cultural language that you're speaking through as well. Make sure that you're adapting policies, hiring procedures, and job requirements to make sure that the agency is accessible and acceptable to a wider range of potential employees, volunteers, survivors as well. Make sure that you're creating guidelines and training on ethical communication and conflict etiquette. I think even for your own internal work, internal teams, it's really important to make sure that you have an understanding of how you all are going to work through issues, how you are just going to speak to each other or talk to each other in different spaces that you're in. Making sure to engage the community in assessing if your services are culturally relevant or responsive. If you're not actively engaged and actively in conversation with the community, there are some major gaps, I can almost assure you. Make sure that you're tailoring your outreach strategies to the communities that you seek to serve. Again, you should be getting feedback from the people that you work with or the people that you serve. And then, of course, have frequent and in-depth staff discussions on systemic oppression and how it relates to our work. If you are not talking about racism, if you are not talking about classism, if you are not talking about misogyny and patriarchy and all of these different areas or all these different intersections, you're not fully doing the work for survivors. And then I think this might be my last piece, but make sure that you're also really applying an anti-oppression lens to our work, even through and within systems. So avoid tokenism and correct it when it shows up. I've been in spaces where I've had director level folks say to me, I'm really glad you're here to work with the Black survivors. And I'm like, well, what are you gonna do if I get sick? What are you gonna do if I leave? Like, what are you gonna do with survivors? Everyone should be able to work with everyone here. White allies, we need y'all to step up when other white allies need to be held accountable. Please do not put all of the onus on people of color or people of color advocates to correct and to inform. Often silence equals violence for many folks. It means that if you're not actively and vocally speaking out or opposing an issue, that you are compliant or you are okay with that issue. It's really important to not tone police Black women, not tone police women of color, period. Listen fully, listen deeply, listen with empathy, and also understand how trauma shows up and the impact that trauma really has on folks' ability to communicate with others. Apply trauma-informed principles when working with staff as well. Make sure to examine language and the histories behind language. Set some goals and remain thoughtful about follow-up. Don't fall into fragility, and when you do, process it and keep going. Remember, healing is a process. It can be a very long process. Remember, justice as well means something very different for a lot of different people. So have those conversations with the people you're working with, right? Like, what does justice look like to you? What does safety look like to you? What does healing look like to you as you navigate this court process? Create space for conversation, again, with the survivors that you're working with the other staff folks and volunteers and community members you're in space with. Embrace confrontation. Now, I will always say this, I do not mean go yell at each other in the hallway. That's not what I'm saying when I say confrontation. What I do mean is be willing to pick apart pieces of the system that we work in. Be willing to pick apart the system even when you are a systems advocate. Like, that's part of the confrontation process. To understand that not everyone has equal access. To understand that not everyone has the resources that they need or are getting their resources in the way that they need. Like, that's confrontation. And then change policies and practices when able and when applicable. If you're understanding that certain policies or practices in the courtroom or in the courthouse generally are harmful to survivors that walk through the door or are harmful to immigrant folks that walk through the door, then go back and change those policies. And then I know the rest of my team here is going to jump in, but really thinking about, like, how do we tie this stuff together? So not only for Black survivors, but immigrant survivors, period. When they experience institutional and organizational bias, they aren't seen as credible. They're often punished for survival. They're expected to present or show up in mainstream ways. They're held to a higher standard than the harm doer, which we've talked about. Oftentimes, survivors are expected to conform in order to receive adequate services or to be believed, period. And then overwhelmingly, when folks experience bias or barriers, their stories and the statistics around their experiences aren't accurately captured. And so a community may be thinking violence is, oh yeah, our violence rates are incredibly low here. But maybe folks aren't coming out because it's not culturally nuanced, it's not culturally responsive, they don't feel heard, they don't feel valued, they don't feel safe. And so it's our work as advocates to make sure we're addressing all these different areas and addressing all these major gaps that sometimes exist. Paula, Shirley, Kelly?
You said it. I don't have anything to add there.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you.
So we can skip this slide. As I mentioned, the connection between language and trauma. And so what do? There's a lot of talk of trauma and depression, which is oppression is traumatic. So how do we respond in a trauma-informed way? And so this was created with the CDC, and these are the principles of trauma-informed care. And as I go through them, do we have, I just want to do a time check, 15 minutes left for the webinar?
We do. Mhm.
Okay, so I'm going to do it before that 15 minutes so that we can have some time for questions. So when I am talking about this,
Sorry, there's like about 13, 15 minutes left of the entire webinar.
I'll do it less than that.
Okay, awesome.
So when I'm talking about this, I want you to think about in two ways, in terms of the survivor and in terms of us, the employees working with gender-based violence. So there's the trauma that survivors experience, and there is the vicarious trauma that we experience. And it's not if we experience it, it's inevitable. All of us that have a heartbeat, that listen to survivors, are going to experience vicarious trauma. And so there's also us that are in this field that have experienced some direct trauma as well, or have or witnessed that trauma. So to acknowledge in terms of our well-being, self-care, and resilience is that we also have stories of trauma while we're supporting those who have been traumatized. And so when we're thinking the first principle of safety, think about safety in all of its forms. And so how does the institution, let's just say it's an organization, a law office, a DA's, whomever, right? So an institution, how are we ensuring safety? It could be physical safety, right? It could be emotional safety, psychological safety. But be thinking about those ways, talk about that as a staff. You could do a survey, an anonymous survey. What would it take? So literally, I remember working in a rape crisis center and making sure I wasn't the only one that left because the hallway after 5:30, the light was turned off. So that was scary for me, and listening to all these cases. I remember the DA's office when there was a case that I knew, okay, this was a consistent defendant, and I knew because I read all the police reports and past that I knew this defendant was a really dangerous defendant. I could not stay later, right? I had to almost sort of, I think about it now, I didn't know it then, but I was safety planned. I had to leave with others in the office. And so think about the physical safety, right? Is there lighting, space? Where are individuals, where are survivors talking to an advocate or an attorney? Is what's on the walls, right? Where are the exits, right? And for us to be talking about that, just so you know, this is our space. There might be an interruption coming because this is the only copier that we have. All those things of also letting folks know what might happen to ensure safety. Trustworthiness and transparency. This means, as I mentioned earlier, of saying, this is what I can do, these are my limitations, or this is my experience with the judge, or I can't promise you a judge. All those things that we say to be transparent, even though we don't want to say them because it's not good news, and it's awful feeling when we're communicating it, it builds trust. At least a survivor is going to know I am going to get the information that I need from this person. This is the same way as an institution, that there is trustworthiness and transparency. And sometimes the answer is, we don't know at this time. Like, we don't know what the outcome is, but I want to ensure you that we're working on it. And you could even say, this is what we're working on, this is what we're stuck with. We can't give more details because of confidentiality and so forth, but to be transparent in the process, right? To be transparent too is, you know what, I was wrong. I thought this was a good policy, and now that we're seeing that COVID hit, it might not be a good policy, so we have to change it. Just that transparency. And we're not perfect, we're all human. But there is, if someone is in a environment where they can't trust, that level of fear is going to go up, right? So both with the staff and with the survivor. Peer support. Doing this work, it's very isolating, right? And so if you're meeting someone and say, oh, what do you do? And you tell them, they're like, oh, or they might say, oh, good for you, right? So depending what reaction you get, but it's isolating, right? I remember starting this and talking about my day to friends and family, and they would just have a blank stare. And I was thinking like, oh yeah, I can't like share because they're not doing the work. Who are your peers? Who are your peers that understand? It is incredibly isolating to experience abuse, intimate partner violence, right? And there is healing and affirmation when in a support group, someone hears a stranger telling their story. It's like, wow, I wasn't the only one. I was told I was the only one. I was told I was crazy. I'm not crazy. Wow, I'm not the only one. And there's the sense of resilience, right? Feeling that you're not the only one. Same thing with the attorneys, with advocates, right? With executive directors, it's very lonely. So if you have within your organization, if you're in a position of creating peer space, without you, if you're a supervisor, without you, that's great. If there are teams or cross teams of working, or you have informal spaces of peer support of individuals that understand what you're going through, it helps with your resilience. Collaboration and mutuality, which goes back to the isolation and then the peer support, is to work with survivors collaboratively, right? As Shirley mentioned about the empowerment, survivors wanting us to tell them what to do, but if you're working together with them, right? To be guided by the survivor knows they're experts, right? They've lived every single day of maintaining their safety, to work in collaboration with survivors, as well as working in collaboration, let's say attorney advocate, attorney, or different units. It enhances the work. Empowerment, voice, and choice. So this means are individuals, are survivors able to give feedback on the services that they received? That could be intimidating, right, for a survivor, but it shapes the way and improves the way in which we are providing services, right? Also in an organization, I remember some folks said that the Monday going into work, the day after going to work after George Floyd, that the organization did not say one word about it. And how the silence felt, like Ayana said, silence is violence. To be able, we're in this field of anti-violence, right? And to be able to express that, and to express that our humanity, right? And to express the injustice that we are living is traumatic, not to be able to express that at work, right? And so are we empowered to talk about things that are working, not working, give input? To go back to the transparency, folks give input, and it's important to know you can give input. That's not necessarily going to mean that that's the outcome, but there is a process for us to find the best outcome with everyone being able to give some input. Which goes to the last one, and that is the cultural, historical, and gender issues. And what Ayana said is that we can't do this work without talking about oppression, which is the realities of the realities that we face as well as survivors face, right? And that are we talking about in our organization about language access, about representation of people of color in leadership roles that are making decisions? Are we talking about cultural and historical issues when we're doing outreach, and not just outreach, but community engagement, right? Are we humble? Are we listening and being guided by the community? Because we don't live one issue lives, right? As we've talked about before here, is that we are experiencing this. There's multiple trauma with immigrants. There's trauma that preceded possibly then coming to the United States. And in the best circumstances of immigration, like let's say you flew first class and you got a job and you have a fabulous group of people, it's an experience of loss. And that experience of loss is also traumatic. And so these are principles that we can incorporate within an institution. There's two things that are essential: institutional responses as well as individual responses, right? And that we start with knowing, having self-awareness. When do I need a break? When is this triggering? This reminds me of a story. To note to self if you're with someone, but then to take care of yourself. And take care of yourself is such a broad, bland words, right? And I would say, and there's also research that talk therapy is great, talking to peers is great. But with the more research is that the body remembers what the mind forgets. And so we carry our trauma and stress in our bodies. And we have to move, whether it's dancing, walking, stretching, whatever it is. We have to move and we have to take care of ourselves, just like the basic stuff, like 8 hours, if you can, of sleep, water, take water and eat and move and so forth. But you know you best. And so self-awareness is essential in your own well-being and resilience. So I'll pause with that. Was that less than 13 minutes?
That was. Thank you, Paula, and thank you to all of our panelists for your insight and your expertise. We have about 2 minutes left if anybody has a very quick question. Otherwise, that is all for today. And please make sure to fill out the webinar evaluation. We do read your evaluations and we use them to inform future trainings. And just a reminder to those of you who are OVW LAV grantees and subgrantees and STOP subgrantees, you are eligible for free technical assistance on your immigration cases from ASISTA. So if you are interested in scheduling an appointment, please use the link in the slide to use our website to do that. Thank you to everybody. Have a great one, everyone.